Content warning. This audiobook contains strong language, sexual themes, supernatural elements, and graphic depictions of death. The author recommends this work for audiences aged 18 and over. If you let your 6-year-old listen, that's on you. Dark Matter, The Order of the Hidden Cross, by Ian Bailey, published by Ashlar Press. Copyright 2025. Chapter 13. Beris and the Shaman. Beris darted along the forest floor, his tiny feet barely making a sound as he rifled through leaves, twigs, and discarded stones. Every once in a while he paused, lifting a particularly shiny pebble to the sunlight streaming through the trees. It shimmered, a brilliant sapphire hue. Beris's eyes widened with glee, his fingers tracing its edges. Shiny, 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 he whispered, his voice tinged with childlike glee, before slipping it into the endless pouch at his side, which seemed to defy any rules of capacity. As soon as the stone disappeared into the endless pocket, his eyes darted elsewhere. "Squirrel!" Beris shouted, then giggled, distracted by movement. He moved with a speed and eagerness that belied his size, picking up anything that caught his attention, examining it, and tossing it aside if it failed to hold his interest. A glint of something in the grass caught his eye, but before he could pounce on it, the earth rumbled beneath his feet, causing him to stumble. "What? What is that?" Beris muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the horizon. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the earth. The rumble grew louder, like thunder rolling through the trees. He spun around just in time to see a cart thundering down the narrow forest path, moving impossibly fast. Beris ducked behind a tree stump, barely avoiding being trampled by the horses as the cart raced past. The driver, a wild-eyed shaman, screamed at the horses, urging them faster. The cart was piled high with strange objects, masks, wooden totems, and trinkets that clinked and rattled with each bounce. But what truly caught Beris's eye was something gleaming from the back, a glimmering object that shone brighter than the sun itself. A cat curled up in the warmth of the sun lounged lazily on the cart's roof, completely indifferent to the chaos around it. As the cart sped past, Beris' gaze locked onto the shiny object in the back. Without a second thought, he darted out from his hiding spot, the thundering hooves of the horses echoing in his ears. His heart raced as his eyes locked onto the glimmering object in the back of the cart, a gleaming jewel nestled among trinkets and oddities. "I need that. I need it," as he breathed out, his voice trembling with desire. The shine of it tugged at his very soul, a magnet for his insatiable hunger for all things precious. It called to him, a light in the chaos of the forest, and Beris, small as he was, could not resist. He scanned his surroundings frantically, searching for a way to chase after the fast-moving cart. That's when he saw it, a rabbit no more than a few feet away, munching contentedly on a patch of clover. Without hesitation, Beris's eyes narrowed, and with a flick of his thoughts, the rabbit's movements froze. The creature's eyes glazed over, falling under the enchantment of Beris's control. With a swift hop, Beris mounted the rabbit, his tiny hands gripping its fur. "Go!" he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. The rabbit leapt forward, its strong legs pushing off the ground with surprising speed. The forest blurred around them as they darted between the trees, leaves rustling and twigs snapping underfoot. But it didn't take long for Beris to realize that the rabbit, despite its best efforts, was no match for the horses. The gap between them and the cart was widening, the gleam of the treasure growing smaller by the second. "Not fast enough," Beris cursed under his breath, his heart pounding in frustration. The rabbit was swift, but the cart's wild speed left it behind. Frustration gnawed at Beris as the shimmering treasure slipped further from view. He didn't have time to waste. He had to switch. His eyes darted through the underbrush until they landed on a fox, its sharp eyes catching the gleam of daylight as it slunk between the trees. Perfect. With a flicker of thought, Beris released the rabbit from his control and turned his focus to the fox. The creature halted mid-step, its instincts overridden by Beris's will. Without missing a beat, Beris leapt from the rabbit onto the fox's back, the animal immediately responding to the new connection. "Run!" Beris hissed, his voice tense with urgency. The fox shot forward, its lithe body weaving through the thick undergrowth with ease. Beris clung tightly to its fur as they sped through the trees, the wind whipping against his face. The ground seemed to vanish beneath them as the fox leapt over fallen branches and dodged between tree trunks. For a moment, Beris felt a surge of hope. The fox was faster, more agile, and they were closing the gap. But the horses were too far ahead, their powerful strides devouring the distance between them and the fading cart. The rumbling of the wheels over the uneven forest path sent a cloud of dust into the air, making it harder for Beris to keep his eyes on the prize. He ground his teeth in frustration, knowing the fox couldn't keep up. "No, no, no," he muttered through gritted teeth. His mind raced, searching for another option. The gleaming object in the cart seemed to taunt him, growing fainter by the moment, slipping through his grasp. Then his eyes caught sight of a bird, a crow, perched on a low-hanging branch. Its small, beady eyes blinked lazily as it preened its feathers, completely unaware of the frantic chase unfolding below. Beris didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. With another flick of his thoughts, the connection with the fox snapped, and the crow's mind was instantly consumed by Beris' control. The bird flapped its wings, confused at first, but Beris's will was too strong. He leapt from the fox's back just as it skidded to a halt, his small form light as a feather as he grasped onto the crow's back. "Up!" he commanded, his voice barely a whisper but full of command. The crow took flight, its wings beating furiously as it lifted Beris into the air. The forest floor shrank beneath him, the trees turning into a sea of green. The cart, now far ahead, rumbled down the path. But from his new vantage point, Beris could see everything clearly. The wind howled in his ears as the bird soared higher, and for a moment Beris forgot the chase. The world below him was vast and wild, stretching out in every direction. The sun bathed the treetops in golden light, and the forest seemed to breathe, alive with the hum of nature. But Beris shook his head, forcing himself to focus. There would be time to admire the beauty of the world later. Right now, all that mattered was the shining treasure in the back of that cart. He directed the crow to circle above the cart, watching it from high above. The horses galloped relentlessly, their hooves kicking up dirt and leaves as they tore through the forest. The shaman, still shouting at them to go faster, seemed oblivious to the small figure gliding overhead. Beris's eyes gleamed as he assessed his next move. The cart bounced violently over the uneven ground, but Beris could see a moment, a single opportunity. As the cart hit a large rock, the back corner lifted slightly, jostling the items in the rear. Now, this was his chance. With a burst of speed, the crow dove, plummeting through the air like a stone. The world blurred around Beris as they streaked toward the cart. Timing was everything. The crow's wings folded tightly, its beak pointed like an arrowhead. The wind roared in Beris's ears, but he focused on the shimmering object. Just as the crow neared the cart, Beris jumped, his tiny form landing in the back with a soft thud. His heart raced, his breath coming in quick bursts as he scrambled for cover, hiding behind a bag of grain. The crow flew off, free from Beris's control, leaving him alone with his prize. He peeked out from behind the bag, scanning his surroundings. The cat, who had been sleeping on top of the cart, stirred slightly, its ears twitching as if sensing something. Beris held his breath, watching the feline closely. But after a moment the cat stretched, yawned, and settled back into its sun-soaked nap. Relief washed over Beris, though his heart still pounded in his chest. The cart bounced and rattled beneath him, the horse's hooves thudding in his ears. But now he was closer, closer to the shimmering treasure that had caught his eye. It was there, just within reach. Suddenly, the cart took a sharp turn off the path, entering a large clearing in the forest's heart. Beris peered out from his hiding spot, just in time to see the horses come to a grinding halt. The shaman jumped down from his seat and walked to the center of the clearing, his eyes scanning the space with a look of purpose. Beris, still hiding behind the sack, watched as the shaman raised his hands toward the sky, muttering something in a language Beris had never heard before. The air grew thick, and without warning, every item in the back of the cart began to rise. Beris's eyes widened in awe and fear. Trinkets, tools, and treasures spun like leaves caught in a whirlwind. There was no wind, no force of nature behind this phenomenon, only the will of the shaman's chant. He ducked down lower, hiding himself from the view of the cat, which still slept through the chaos. The items began to spin faster and faster, whirling into a chaotic spiral. The very earth trembled as trees groaned, roots ripping from the soil, and plants, rocks, and pieces of the forest floor began converging into the whirlwind. Beris gasped as a massive swirl of debris surrounded him. He tried to hold on to the cart's edge, but the force was too great. Without thinking, he jumped from the cart, landing awkwardly beside the wheel just as the shaman lowered his hands. And then, as if the very world itself held its breath, everything stopped. The chaotic whirlwind collapsed in on itself, spiraling inward with a velocity that defied reason. Trees, branches, leaves, and fragments of earth twisted together in a violent dance, their forms blurring into a single chaotic mass. The very air seemed to crackle with energy, charged with an ancient power that hummed in the bones of the forest. Birds scattered from the treetops, their cries drowned out by the furious gusts of wind that whipped through the clearing. Even the sky seemed to bow under the weight of it, darkening as if it too were being drawn into the vortex. For a fleeting moment, just as the chaos reached its zenith, the world seemed to hold its breath. The swirling debris, the storm of matter, halted mid-air, suspended by some unseen force. Time stretched out impossibly thin, as though the entire forest were balancing on the edge of a knife. In that stillness, the roar of the storm became a deafening silence, the kind of silence that makes the heart stop, for fear that any sound could shatter the fragile illusion of peace. Then, with a soundless snap, it happened. Everything, the swirling branches, the twisting shards of earth, the disjointed pieces of the world, converged into a single point. The convergence was so absolute, so precise, that it was as though the universe itself had been folded down to a singularity. For the briefest of moments, it was as if reality itself blinked, caught between two breaths. And then, just as suddenly, the chaos was gone. In its place, standing as though it had always been there, was a cottage. It was a modest thing, yet it radiated an inexplicable sense of permanence, as though it had existed for centuries, tucked away in the forgotten corners of the world. Weathered stone walls, covered in patches of moss, stood firm and unyielding. The wooden shingles on the roof, dulled by time, sloped gently, and a thin plume of smoke curled lazily from the chimney as though a fire had been burning for hours. Flower pots, filled with bright blooms that should not have survived the vortex, lined the window sills, and a cobbled path led to a sturdy oak door, its handle gleaming faintly in the fading light. The air in the clearing was still now, almost unnaturally so. The chaotic storm that had ravaged the forest moments before had left no trace of its violence. The trees stood untouched, their branches swaying gently in a breeze that no longer carried the weight of ancient magic. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire inside the cottage, welcoming the return of peace. It was as though the cottage had not been built but had simply become willed into existence by forces beyond comprehension. A structure born not of wood and stone, but of raw magic and the will of the shaman, who now stood in its shadow surveying his creation with an air of quiet satisfaction. The shaman, his gnarled hands still raised from the final gesture of his spell, lowered them slowly, his breath coming in slow, deliberate exhales. His face, lined with age and wisdom, betrayed no surprise at the sight before him. This was no accident. This was the culmination of a ritual older than memory, a magic woven through time itself. He had called forth this cottage from the chaos, from the very bones of the earth, and it had answered. It stood now as timeless and enduring as the forest that surrounded it. Yet, for all its apparent serenity, there was something unsettling about the cottage, something that spoke of ancient secrets buried deep within its walls, something that hinted at a power far greater than the stones and mortar that made up its form. But for now, in this moment, it simply stood, timeless. Beris stared wide-eyed as the shaman walked over to the horses, unhitching them and guiding them to a stable that had not existed a moment ago. The shaman muttered soothing words to the animals, feeding them hay as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Beris, still trembling, took the opportunity to slip inside the cottage. If the outside was magical, the inside was downright mystical. A teapot floated across the room, pouring itself into a cup that rested in mid-air. The shaman sat in a chair, picking up a book and sipping the tea without so much as a glance at the floating objects. The cup hovered in the air, waiting for the next sip. Beris took the opportunity now that the cat was asleep and the shaman had drifted into a light slumber, the book resting lazily in his hands. The soft crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sound of the shaman's slow breaths created a gentle lull that filled the room. This was his chance to explore without being noticed, to uncover the secrets of this strange, magical cottage, and, most importantly, to find the shiny object that had caught his eye in the back of the cart. He tiptoed quietly into the open, every instinct telling him to move with care. The room was alive with magic, each corner infused with an unseen energy that made the very air hum. But it was the kitchen that truly held his attention. Beris's eyes widened as he stepped closer, drawn in by an almost hypnotic scene playing out before him. A knife hovered in mid-air, spinning effortlessly as it sliced through vegetables on the kitchen counter. Potatoes, onions, carrots, all were chopped with precision, their pieces landing neatly in a bubbling pot suspended over the fire. The soft hissing and bubbling sounds of the stew filled the room, and a mouth-watering aroma wafted up, causing Beris's stomach to rumble in spite of himself. The knife worked quickly and with purpose, moving from vegetable to vegetable without hesitation, as if guided by an invisible hand. It was not alone. Around it, other objects floated lazily in the air, spoons stirring the pot, herbs being plucked from bunches hanging above, and even a cloth wiping up the occasional splash. All of it was carried out with the same silent precision, as if orchestrated by some unseen chef who had no need for physical form. Beris stood there for a moment in awe, watching the cooking scene unfold before him. It was mesmerizing. The stew simmered with a low, contented burble, and every now and then a ladle would rise from the countertop, dip into the pot, and pour a taste into a floating bowl as though sampling its own work. The smell was intoxicating, a rich blend of herbs and vegetables that filled the air with warmth and comfort. But Beris, despite being thoroughly entranced, shook his head after a few long moments to come back to the reality of his mission. He was here for something much shinier than a stew. He couldn't lose focus now. As his eyes roved across the room, he finally spotted it. Tucked under the window, hidden in the shadows but unmistakable in its allure, was a box. More like a chest, its wooden frame was etched with delicate carvings, and even from this distance Beris could tell it was something special. His heart quickened with excitement. This had to be it. This was where the real treasure was kept. Carefully, Beris crept toward the chest, mindful not to disturb the floating objects still busy at work. His small hands hovered over the lock, and with a deft twist of his fingers, the latch clicked open. The lid creaked slightly as Beris slowly lifted it, revealing a sight that made his breath catch in his throat. Inside, gleaming in the dim light, was a fortune. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and gold glittered before him, each jewel more stunning than the last. It was as though the stars themselves had been captured and stored away in this small chest. For a moment, Beris could hardly contain his excitement. He had never seen so many beautiful, shimmering things in one place. He began stuffing his pouch with the most dazzling gems, his tiny hands moving quickly as if the treasure might vanish at any moment. But before he could get far, something shifted in the room. There was a sudden weight in the air, and Beris froze, a shiver running down his spine. An invisible force gripped him, pulling him away from the chest and lifting him into the air. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled, but it was no use. He was caught. Slowly, a faint shimmer revealed the outline of a figure. A servant, invisible until now, held Beris aloft. The creature's form flickered as it moved, as if light bent around its being, and without a word it whisked Beris over to the shaman, who still sat in his chair, now stirring slightly as he drifted between sleep and wakefulness. With a firm nudge, the invisible servant kicked the shaman awake, thrusting Beris into his view. The shaman stirred groggily, blinking in confusion. His eyes, heavy with sleep, focused on the small creature dangling in midair. Slowly, the shaman's confusion gave way to understanding, and a bemused smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. With a flick of his wrist, the shaman made a simple gesture. Beris's pouch floated over, spilling its contents into the shaman's outstretched palms. The gems poured out in a stream, more than the shaman could hold, overflowing and spilling onto the floor in a cascade of glittering wealth. Beris stared in horror, his small body trembling as he floated helplessly. The shaman's eyes, a mix of disappointment and amusement, shifted to the sleeping cat. With a click of his tongue, he gave the cat a disapproving look. "You should have been watching him," the shaman muttered to the cat, who merely blinked sleepily before stretching out again, unbothered. The shaman turned back to Beris, his expression softening. "You little thief," he murmured, almost kindly. But his hand moved with purpose. A glass cube materialized around Beris, trapping him in an invisible prison. Beris pressed his tiny hands against the walls, bewildered. He could see through it, but there was no escape. As Beris floated helplessly in the grip of the invisible servant, panic seized him. His tiny heart pounded in his chest, the shimmering treasure he had so greedily taken, now scattered across the floor, the weight of his situation closing in like the walls of a cage. Desperation clawed at his thoughts, and with a wild flicker of hope, he remembered the memory-erasing chants he had learned long ago. If he could just make the shaman forget that he ever saw him, forget he existed at all, then he could escape this nightmare. "Velatir somnara," he shouted, the words slipping from his tongue in a frantic, hurried chant. His small voice, shrill and trembling, filled the room as he cast the spell in a last-ditch attempt to salvage his freedom. "Melis caro dormas vinara." But the shaman barely blinked. His eyes were on the floating jewels, the stream of treasure pouring from Beris's pouch into his outstretched hands, as if nothing more than a passing curiosity. Beris' voice cracked, his chants growing more frenzied. "Distara, melatris, fortas." The ancient words tumbled out of him, each one more desperate than the last, his hands flailing against the invisible prison that held him in midair. "For Garem, forget," he screamed, the final plea leaving his throat raw. But the shaman paid no attention to the foibles of this little creature. His focus didn't waver. He barely even glanced up, his expression calm and almost amused as Beris's magic sputtered into the air and dissolved like mist. To the shaman, these weak little spells were nothing, fleeting wisps of nonsense that couldn't even scratch the surface of his ancient knowledge. Beris's voice faltered, the last of his chants falling silent in the thick air. He watched in helpless disbelief as his memory spells had no effect, not even a flicker of recognition from the shaman. The power imbalance was overwhelming. His magic was nothing here, just the impotent cry of a creature far too small for the world he'd tried to steal from. The shaman let the last of the gems trickle through his fingers, his gaze settling on Beris with a quiet, measured intensity. And in that moment, Beris realized there was no escape. He whispered the words like a lullaby, clinging to the hope they'd work this time. The shaman stood, walking to a bookshelf. He thumbed through a few old tomes, muttering to himself. After finding the right one, he nodded, satisfied, and walked back to Beris. He opened the book, his finger tracing the ancient text as he read the words aloud. Beris felt the world shift around him. The air grew cold, and a darkness thicker than any night pressed in from all sides. His body felt weightless, suspended in a void that defied description. The light of the cottage dimmed, growing distant as the shaman's voice became a murmur in the background. Beris's heart raced as his world began to dissolve into nothingness. The familiar objects of the cottage, the floating tea, the knife-chopping vegetables, the simmering stew, faded from view, replaced by an all-encompassing blackness. And then, with the final wrenching pull, Beris was cast into the dark matter. There was no light here, no sound. The world he had known moments ago dissolved into an inky void, and with it went any sense of orientation. He couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. He couldn't feel his hands, his legs, or even the air on his skin. It was as if his very existence was being erased, bit by bit. "Please," he whispered, his voice swallowed by the endless void. No echo, no response. Panic gripped him. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, muted by the oppressive silence. His heart raced, but even that he could not hear. Time had no meaning in this place. Seconds stretched into eternity, and Beris, once so full of life and energy, was reduced to a drifting speck in an ocean of nothingness. He drifted, weightless and voiceless, a speck consumed by infinite emptiness. The vast void pressed against him, smothering even his memories. For the first time, Beris understood the true meaning of loneliness, not absence, but the crushing presence of nothingness. Tears welled in his eyes, though he could not feel them fall. In this vast empty darkness, he realized what he had truly lost. Not the shiny gems or treasures, but the warmth of the world, the feel of the earth beneath his feet, the sound of the wind in the trees. It was all gone, and in its place was this infinite cold void. He had chased after something shiny, only to find himself lost in the dark. The shaman, satisfied, closed the book and returned to his chair. For a brief moment, as the book settled on his lap, a faint shadow of something akin to sorrow flickered across the shaman's weathered face. His gaze lingered on the empty space where Beris had once been, now just a faint memory in the quiet cottage. The flicker of amusement and bemusement that had lit his eyes before had dimmed, replaced by something older, heavier. As he leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifted to another time, to another mischievous spirit. An old friend, long gone now, who had once roamed these woods with the same playful recklessness. He remembered the laughter that echoed through the trees, the trickery that always came with a smile, and the mischief that had been harmless, mostly. They had stolen time together in those days, chasing the shimmer of life's fleeting joys. A nostalgic ache bloomed quietly in the back of his mind, soft but persistent. That friend, drawn to the same glittering distractions, had vanished long ago, swallowed by the very magic they once delighted in. For a moment, Beris's small form was a reflection of that lost companion, a fleeting spark doomed to flicker out. Perhaps it was the nature of small, bright souls to chase after what dazzled until they found themselves caught in the dark. The shaman blinked, the weight of years settling on his shoulders. He hadn't thought about that old companion in centuries, and the memory was bittersweet, sharp in its clarity, dulled by the passing of too many years. For just a moment, Beris's fate had stirred something deep within him, a recognition of what the little creature had been searching for. But time moves on, he reminded himself, and those who chase what glitters too eagerly often fall into their own shadows. He sighed deeply, shaking the nostalgia from his bones. With a final glance at the place where Beris had been, he let the memory slip from his thoughts, like a leaf drifting down river. His eyes grew heavy, his mind clouded with sleep. The cat stirred by the fire, purring softly as the crackling flames cast flickering shadows on the walls. The invisible servant, ever watchful, lingered in the corner, waiting for the next command. The shaman, lost in the haze of old memories and fading thoughts, drifted off into a quiet slumber, the weight of the years cradling him into sleep. The cottage, once full of light and life, felt somehow emptier now. Beris reached out, but his hands met nothing. The emptiness pressed in, cold and infinite, stealing even his tears before they could fall, not from fear, but from a profound, hollow loneliness. His world had been reduced to shadows and silence, and he realized in the darkness, Beris thought not of the gems but of the forest, the rustling leaves, the warmth of sunlight. He reached for it, but it was gone, leaving only the shadows he had chased. He was just Beris, small, alone, and utterly forsaken. This chapter may have ended, but the story doesn't. Return next Monday for what waits in the dark. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and leave a comment